For 4 years, Harry and Meghan's names stayed on the official royal website. Think about that timeline for a second and really sit with each item on it. The Oprah interview on the website, the Netflix documentary, 2 hours of footage specifically designed to make the institution look dysfunctional and cruel on the website. Spare with every private conversation, every family argument, every intimate moment that most royal families would consider completely off-limits, laid out in a published book available in airport bookshops around the world, still on the website. Through every bombshell, every headline, every revelation that had royal watchers and ordinary Brits shaking their heads, the palace just left them there, listed, legitimized, still part of the official record of the British royal family, still searchable, still linkable, still carrying the implicit endorsement of the institution. I think you can summarize this trip in 2 words: desperation and failure. Desperation and failure. Yikes. And double yikes. Desperation and failure. My goodness. That always bothered a significant number of people who follow this institution closely, and not in a petty or vindictive way. Not because of some personal vendetta against Harry and Meghan as human beings, but because that listing meant something real and specific. And the palace knew it meant something real and specific. It meant the palace officially, and in a format that anyone with an internet connection could access, was still signaling continuity, still holding the door open, still lending the credibility and the weight of the monarchy to 2 people who had spent 4 years doing everything short of burning it down. And now, quietly, in the way the palace always does the things it once done, but doesn't want to explain publicly, the page has changed. Is known to hold a grudge, and more than that, he cannot forgive his brother for what Harry has put his family through. No press conference, no formal announcement, no carefully worded statement from a palace spokesperson explaining the decision. Just a quiet update to a website. The way you'd update opening hours on a small business page, and suddenly the Sussex section of the official royal website looks very different from what it used to. Royal watchers noticed within hours. They always do, because this is the kind of detail this community was built to catch. Social media lit up. The screenshots started circulating, and the debate about what it means started almost immediately, because in royal communications, nothing is ever simply a website update. Calls is not the pushover that the press seems to think he is, and that they're trying to present him as being. He has not been taking his son's calls for some time now. Let's talk about why this matters. Because the obvious read is it's just a website. And if that's where you're landing, stick with me, because it goes considerably deeper than that. That page was not just information. It was legitimacy. It was the palace saying officially, publicly, in a format that Google could index and journalists could link to and business partners could reference. These 2 people are still part of this. The royal connection still holds. And that connection had real, tangible, commercially meaningful value beyond the symbolic. Is someone who's desperate for fame. She's desperate for recognition. She's desperate for money, of course, and status. Now, isn't that for every business deal, every partnership negotiation, every product with a price premium attached? The underlying value proposition rested on that royal association, on the Duchess of Sussex title still meaning something concrete, because the institution that granted it was still, however, quietly acknowledging it and giving it visibility. When you remove that page or significantly change what it contains, you're not doing a spring clean of the website. You are withdrawing something that had been silently doing real work for a commercial operation that depends on royal adjacency to justify its pricing. And you're doing it right before a planned UK visit, right as Harry and Meghan were apparently building toward a new public narrative, right when some observers were starting to think momentum might finally be shifting in their direction. The timing, as with almost everything the palace does, is not accidental. He is not allowing Harry to make hay while the sun shines and take advantage. And if he sees Harry, and if he sees the children, it's my understanding is it's going to be in very limited, constricted terms. This is also where Tom Bower's 2-word summary lands with the weight it carries. Desperation and failure. Those are harsh words deliberately chosen from someone who spent years investigating this family and who does not reach for dramatic language without having a specific reason to map those words onto the commercial picture. The Netflix deal restructured. Spotify gone with its executives parting shots, still circulating. The as-ever traffic contracting, the speaking fees falling, the R12 Foundation deficit in its public filings, and then add the website change on top of all of that. One more official lifeline quietly withdrawn, and Bauer's framing starts to look less like opinion and more like a description of a sequence of observable facts. Harry was always, shall we say, the one that was difficult, always wanting to mess around, an attention seeker, many might say. Without that royal association, without the credibility that comes from being officially listed as part of the institution, the as-ever brand, the candles, the jam, the wine, the whole carefully styled premium lifestyle operation has to compete in a market where it's just another lifestyle brand up against Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop, against established names with decades of brand building behind them, against dozens of other celebrity lifestyle projects that compete on product quality and customer loyalty rather than on proximity to a title. That is a much harder commercial proposition. The price points that made sense when the Duchess of Sussex label carried institutional weight become harder to justify when the institution has quietly withdrawn its endorsement. And everybody involved in that operation, every advisor, every brand strategist, every person who has been watching the web traffic numbers knows it is a much harder commercial proposition. I believe we are looking at a deeply corrupt establishment institution working with Harry and the palace to rehabilitate Harry's image and bring him back. It has been giving you the full picture on this when the mainstream coverage has been busy writing about the warmer, more photogenic version of events. The like button keeps this channel going, and it genuinely is the single easiest thing you can do to help. Now, let's talk about who is behind this move, because this is the part of the story that actually surprised me, and that cuts against the dominant media narrative of the last several months. Diana's philanthropic legacy is not there to act as a PR angle for Prince Harry. For weeks, the dominant framing across most major outlets has been presenting Charles and William as divided on how to handle Harry. Charles, the emotional father, still open, still hoping, the man whose love for his son makes him more forgiving than the institution probably needs him to be. William, the institutionalist, firm, already operating mentally as a future king rather than as a sibling, drawing permanent lines and intending to hold them. That framing makes a good headline. It creates a family drama inside the institutional drama, and it has the advantage of being at least partly true. There is genuine tension between a father's instincts and an heir's strategic thinking. But Lady Colin Campbell pushed back on that framing very specifically, and with some force. Failure because there is no money. The end. There is no money. Harry and Meghan are making no money. And whatever you think of her as a commentator, she is polarizing. She is opinionated. She will say things that make you wheeze. She has established sources inside the institution. And she has been accurate about specific details that later turned out to be correct when the full picture emerged. Her argument on this specific point is that Charles and William are far more united on Harry than the press coverage has suggested, that the divided family framing serves a narrative more than it reflects the actual situation inside the palace. Not a grieving father and a cold institutionalist pulling in opposite directions. Two men separately, but consistently sending the same message from their respective positions. We are not available. Not to calls that have reportedly gone unanswered for months. Not to requests that keep arriving dressed up in different framings and different contexts. And apparently, finally, not to the continued legitimacy signal of a website listing that the institution had been meaning to address for 4 years. Seeing them effectively crawl on bended knee back to Britain, and they are to be pathetically grateful if the king agrees. Just let that sink. The quote that stayed with me from Lady Colin Campbell on the subject of Charles and his relationship with Harry. He will not be exploited by his son. Not he is carefully navigating a difficult family dynamic. Not he loves Harry and is keeping all options open. He will not be exploited. That is a very deliberate choice of language, and it describes a man with a position, a firm, clear, settled position rather than a man who's still working out how he feels. And then there is the matter of the brief meeting, which keeps coming up in this conversation because it deserves to, because the Queen was very firm, if you remember, chums, about you're either in or you're out. There's no half in. There's no benefits. This is the deal. The last widely reported face-to-face between Harry and his father. Multiple, credible sources indicated the meeting was expected to last significantly longer than it actually did. Harry traveled a very long way across multiple time zones. The meeting ended quickly and early. Then Harry left. That is not the behavior pattern of someone distributing reconciliation freely, or of an institution giving a difficult family member everything he asks for. That is a father who still loves a son. That part seems genuinely true based on everything people who know Charles say about it, and who has also learned over several years of being surprised by what happened to things he said in private to protect himself and the institution from being used as material for the next project. Believes his brother crossed a line in both his 2021 interview with Oprah Winfrey and his autobiography Spare, in which he shared, among other things, intimate details about his and Meghan's relationship with Kate Middleton, the Princess of Wales. The brief meeting is not a story about cruelty. It's a story about a man who has been burned enough times to know what fire feels like when it's approaching. Now, let's get into the BBC story, because this one deserves real attention, and I don't think it has received anywhere near enough of it in mainstream coverage. It's the kind of story that gets buried because the surface detail Harry donates to charity, good for him, sounds uncomplicated and even heartwarming. And the complications underneath require actually reading through the receipts rather than just the headline. Last September, Harry was in the UK for a series of charitable appearances. One of those appearances generated a very specific and widely celebrated headline. Harry had personally donated £1 million to BBC children in need. Some outlets went further and described it as one of the most generous personal charitable gifts made by a modern royal. That's a powerful framing. It repositions Harry as someone putting real money behind real causes. It counters the narrative of someone who extracts commercial value from his royal identity without giving back. It's exactly the kind of story you'd want circulating right before a return to the UK. Except one independent journalist did what journalists are supposed to do when a headline seems almost too perfectly constructed. Is one big club insiders. I have long said the establishment are still protecting Prince Harry. At this point, I would argue, did he ever really leave? She saw the figure. She noted the timing. She registered that the presentation was unusually polished. And she did the simplest possible thing. She contacted the BBC directly and asked a single clear question. Did this donation come from Harry personally or through another source? The BBC responded in writing. They confirmed a personal donation from the Duke of Sussex. Then the fuller picture started to come out because the funds, according to people who dug into the actual transaction, came through the Glenn Begg Foundation, a charitable entity connected to assets inherited from Princess Diana, not from Harry's personal finances in any straightforward take money from my bank account sense, from a foundation that exists because Diana left something behind when she died. Now, is donating through a charitable foundation wrong? No, not at all. Is using inherited assets for charitable giving wrong? Absolutely not. And there's a real argument that Diana would have been proud to see those assets going to causes for children. The Glenn Egg Foundation exists because of her generosity and her values, and using it for good work is genuinely good. But here's the question. Is a donation rooted through a charitable foundation built on assets inherited from Princess Diana the same thing as a personal donation from the Duke of Sussex in any meaningful sense? Those two phrases describe very different things. A personal donation implies Harry reached into his own finances and made a choice. A foundation donation means money moved through a vehicle that exists for the specific purpose of moving money to causes, funded by an inheritance rather than by Harry's commercial earnings. The BBC had the transaction records. They knew where this money came from and what vehicle it moved through. They chose the phrasing that generated the warmer, more newsworthy, more personally flattering headline. And that choice is worth noting because it isn't the first time the BBC's framing of Sussex stories has raised eyebrows among people who look carefully at the details. For people who had been watching the BBC's relationship with the Sussex narrative over several years, this was another entry in a ledger that had been growing for a while. And for people who cared about Diana, who remembered what she actually stood for, how carefully she chose her causes, how uncomfortable she was with the idea of her philanthropy being used for self-promotion rather than the causes themselves. The idea that her charitable legacy was being used as the fuel for a headline about her son's personal generosity, without that context being made clear, sits in an uncomfortable place. It's hard to fully articulate why it sits wrong because the giving itself is good and real. It just sits wrong. And a lot of royal watchers, particularly those who follow Diana closely and who have strong feelings about how her legacy should be treated, felt it. Let's go back to the website and what it actually means legally, because there's a practical dimension here that tends to get lost in the symbolism, and it matters for understanding what this change can and cannot actually do. Harry is a prince by birth. That is constitutional bedrock, and it cannot be changed by King Charles acting alone, by royal decree, by a press release, or by updating a website. Changing Harry's fundamental status as a prince would require an act of parliament. A lengthy, politically complex, historically unprecedented process in the modern era that nobody in the current political landscape has shown any appetite for pursuing, and rightly so. So, the website change does not remove anything from Harry legally. Prince Harry remains Prince Harry regardless of whether the palace lists him on their official pages or not. But the HRH designation, the working royal status, the formal recognition that comes with being listed as an active member of the royal family, those exist in a different legal context and are subject to different mechanisms of change. And here is the part that most coverage glosses over. Those designations are ultimately within the control of the sovereign, which means, right now they rest with Charles. And in the future, they will rest with whoever succeeds Charles, which barring anything extraordinary means William. Which means every signal William sends right now about how he handles Harry, about what lines he draws, about what kind of king he intends to be on this specific question, is directly relevant to the practical future of the Sussex titles in a way that Charles's current approach may not fully be. And the Duchess of Sussex title, the commercial recognition that comes with it, the value it carries in contract negotiations and brand positioning that sits somewhere in the middle, granted by the institution, technically subject to the authority of the sovereign, and ultimately, whenever the succession happens, subject to the authority of whoever follows Charles as king. Which is why William's signals have always mattered more than most people acknowledge. Whatever he would or would not do as a future king shapes the actual practical future of these titles in ways that extend well beyond any current website update. The Sandringham Summit of January 2020 keeps coming back into focus whenever the story moves, and for genuinely good reason, because it is the moment when the institutional rules were most clearly stated and, subsequently, most clearly ignored. A 93-year-old queen who had already navigated abdication crisis. Diana, Charles, and Camilla, Andrew, and 70 years of extraordinary personal sacrifice in the name of public service, sat down with her grandson and genuinely tried to find a path forward. She was not cold about it. By all accounts, she genuinely wanted a solution that would let Harry remain connected to the family and the institution while respecting the reality of what he and Meghan wanted. The effort was real, and the care was real. But her position communicated in the way she always communicated difficult positions quietly without drama, but with absolute clarity, was also entirely clear in or out. Not a hybrid role, not the HR and the deals, and the freedom to criticize the institution you were still technically representing. Not the royal connection with the Oprah interview attached. In or out, the palace tried to fudge it for a year. Then they tried to manage it for 4 more years, hoping perhaps that time and distance would resolve things without requiring any explicit institutional action. The website update might be the moment they finally acknowledged that the Queen had it right the first time. For 4 years after that meeting, the website kept Harry and Meghan's names listed as though the in/out question had been resolved in the direction of in, as though the Sandringham conversation had produced a workable middle path rather than a clear choice that one party subsequently chose not to fully honor. For everyone who admired what Queen Elizabeth II built and what she protected. For everyone who watched 70 years of extraordinary public service conducted with genuine discipline and real personal cost. Watching the palace's official website signal continuity with 2 people who had spent 4 years doing the opposite of what she asked of them at Sandringham felt like a quiet but ongoing contradiction that deserved to be resolved. The website update, subtle as it is, and it is genuinely subtle, not a dramatic public statement but a quiet administrative change, feels to many people like the first real institutional step toward resolving that contradiction and acknowledging that the Queen's position at Sandringham was actually the right one. Not toward cruelty, not toward cutting off a family member, but toward the institutional clarity that Queen Elizabeth actually asked for in that room in January 2020. And that took 5 years to begin to appear. Tom Bower doesn't use dramatic language without reason. His entire professional reputation rests on accuracy rather than sensationalism. And he summarized the current situation with 2 words: desperation and failure. You can agree or disagree with that specific framing. But the fact that someone with his sourcing and his track record is using that language publicly is itself data about where things actually stand rather than where the narratives want us to think they stand. The UK visit is still coming. Reports suggest Archie and Leet might come along. And if that happens, a grandfather who has been managing cancer treatment, who by every account genuinely wants to know his grandchildren, who reportedly has not seen them in years. That image is going to generate an enormous emotional response. And it's going to be presented as evidence that things are healing. And maybe things will heal in some small way in some private corner of that visit. None of us can know what happens behind closed doors. But the visit doesn't resolve the institutional questions. And it doesn't change the signals the palace has been sending. It doesn't change the website. It doesn't change what Spare said or what the Netflix documentary showed or what the Oprah interview contained. Those things exist permanently in the record. A visit is a visit. An institution's formal position is a different thing entirely. There is one more dimension to this that I want to flag before we get to the outro. And it connects to a broader question about how this family handles the Harry situation going forward as we get closer to the succession question inevitably coming into focus. Every time the palace withdraws something, a listing, an acknowledgement, a meeting that ends sooner than expected, it narrows the space Harry has available to reposition himself without making a more fundamental choice. The in/out framing that Queen Elizabeth established in January 2020 is still the right frame, and every palace action since then has been moving, however, slowly, toward making the choice between those 2 options explicit rather than leaving it perpetually ambiguous. The website is the latest move in that direction. It is not the last. Right now, the signals are unusually clear for an institution that usually deals exclusively in ambiguity. Charles is reportedly not taking the calls. The website has changed. The brief meeting ended sooner than expected. Tom Bower is using words like desperation. William is drawing lines through his actions that the record suggests he intends to maintain. And a journalist asked one simple question about a BBC charity donation and found that the simple headline version of the story did not survive basic contact with the actual transaction records. All of these things are happening simultaneously in the same general window pointing in the same general direction. That is not coincidence, and it is not a series of unrelated administrative decisions happening to cluster together at a similar time. That is a palace that has made a series of quiet, individually deniable, collectively coherent decisions, and is now watching to see what the response is before deciding what to do next. Drop your take in the comments. Do you think the website change means Charles and William are now genuinely aligned on the Harry question? Or is it just routine palace housekeeping that's being read too hard by people who are always looking for signals? And what do you think actually happens during the UK visit? A genuine moment of connection, or more of the same carefully managed distance dressed up as a family reunion? I read every single comment that comes in on these videos, and they genuinely shape what we cover next. Some of the best analysis of this family happens in the comment section of this channel. Subscribe so you never miss what we cover. Hit like if this gave you something to think about, and I'll see you in the next.